Hi guys. I will be talking about the future of JavaScript, which is ECMAScript version 6, codename Harmony. First, a few things about me. My name is Michał Gołe, biowski. I work at Laboratorium EE, it's a Warsaw company. I've joined the jQuery core team a few months ago, and here's my Twitter handle and a GitHub link. And a little bit of history first. JavaScript was really created in a rush. Netscape was very afraid that Microsoft will create something else, and they wanted to have some market lead. So in fact, it was the first version was created in just 10 days by Brendan Eich, which shows somehow in the some mistakes in the architecture that we still have to struggle today. The language was submitted to the ECMA International Organization, and it's standardized as ECMAScript, which is versioned. There were versions 1, 2, 3, and there were huge plans for version 4 to fix a lot of stuff, to introduce a lot of new stuff, but there were a lot of disagreements between browser vendors, and finally this version was abandoned. And instead, a few years later, the approach was changed. First, the language was supposed to be was fixed a little in ECMAScript 5 and later 5.1. There was so-called strict mode introduced. First of all, it threw much more errors because in so-called sloppy mode, that is outside of the strict mode, a lot of errors are silent errors. Something just doesn't work, but there's no error to the console, and it's very easy to mess something up because of that. And there are no implicit globals in strict mode, which was a huge mistake. If you omit the keyword var in JavaScript and you assign something to it, you create an implicit global variable, and it's very easy to make a mistake and to create such variables by accident if you make a little typo in your code. So it's good that this is not possible anymore in strict mode. And there are minor syntax additions, namely getters and setters, and something like that. The new syntax is coming in the next version of ECMAScript, codename Harmony. Finally, all the vendors are agreeing on something, so it seems this time we won't have an abandoned version. And simultaneously, the ECMAScript version 7 is created because as a lot of browsers currently, like Chrome, Firefox, and now Opera, changed their schedule to the release model to a rapid release model that they are releasing very often. They want to do something like that in ECMAScript so that we have new versions quickly and so that we don't have to wait so long for it. So the first problem I want to talk about is the var keyword to declare variables. Most problems concerned to that is that it has a function scope and there is variable hoisting, which means that if you have code like that, you declare a variable inside the if false block, but in fact it's declared above. The browser interprets it like that. The var, the declaration itself is moved to the top, and just the assignment is where it really occurs. Which means that if you go to this else block, the variables exist at this point, they're just undefined. So if you removed something inside this if block, you would get error in the else block, which is not obvious. Another thing, if you look at the code like that, you just wanted to assign something to the variable if it wasn't defined before, and this code works perfectly fine. But let's assume that sometime later you decided that, well, if x is undefined, then you don't want to assign something to the x, but instead to another variable named y, for example. And suddenly you got a reference error, which seems weird because we didn't change anything in this line, we just changed something in the next line. So why is there an error in the first line? It's because of that, because of the function scope in the language. The var declaration is really moved to the top. So if you look at the first example, the variable is already declared, it's just undefined. In the second example, the var y is moved to the top. So we don't have x defined at this point, which causes an error. Another problem is leaking globals. if you have somewhere in the code declared the variable with some value, but the code is huge, in another place you might want to use the same variable, for example, for iterating, and because of the function scope, this variable isn't self-contained in the for. So it's you're just overwriting the variable you declared earlier, and there is no error even in strict mode. So you get something else that you expected. ECMAScript 6 will solve this with two new keywords. The first of them is the let keyword. First of all, it does have a block scope, so you won't have leaking variables like that. There's a reference error here. And what I said before, there's no leaking variables. If you are inside the if block, then the x has the value 8 in this case, but once you exit the block, the declaration from above comes. And there is no hoisting. So the declaration isn't moved to the top, it stays where it is. So if you first try to assign something to the variable and then you declare it, there's the reference error. There is also the const keyword, which is very similar to the let keyword. It also has block scope and no hoisting, but it requires initialization and can't be overwritten. So first it requires initialization, so the parser requires that you assign something where you declare the variable, otherwise you get a syntax error, and you can't redefine the variable. One thing worth knowing is that const is a shallow constant, which means you can't anywhere else in the code put something like a equals 5, but it doesn't mean you can't modify the variable, but by modifying its fields, invoking functions on it, etc. It just means the reference to the variable must stay the same. So, in fact, this means that once you rewrite your code to the let and const style, as Olaf Lassus, one of the people I will talk later, said, const is the new var, not let. Really, most situations where you would use let is inside some loops where you are really changing the variable on each iterations. In normal code, you usually use const. And the question of browser support. There is some browser support for let and const, and one browser actually has implemented it in the stable version. So if you wanted to guess which browser it is, we know one browser that is usually implementing things very fast, faster than others. So it's Internet Explorer 11. This is the first browser. It was released a few days ago officially, so it's stable at the point. And this is the first browser version that has let and const publicly available, not behind any flags and stuff like that. Another browser is Chrome, but this is not yet publicly available. It's only available if you enable experimental JavaScript flag, and only in strict mode, which is not valid according to the current ECMAScript 6 draft. So you can't use it in Chrome on public-faced websites, but it still means you can use it for testing on the localhost. And there is Firefox, which has let and const support, but they don't conform to the spec yet. And this is mostly because let was the idea of Mozilla, and they pushed to make it a standard, which was finally made. But obviously, as it is with standards, there were some objections to the rules, so they were changed. And as a result, let and const don't conform fully to the spec. For example, const has a function scope like var, and let is hoisted. So we have to be aware of that. And there is a gotcha that is present in all browsers that support let and const. And in the for loop, like you see here, on each iterations there should be created a new boundings for the variable, which means that inside the loop you should have really a new instance of I, which, okay, maybe this is not a good example. I should put it inside the side timeout, because if you have a synchronous code, it will print what it should, but if you put a timeout around it, then what you really have on I is the reference to the last point when the variable was changed, which will be 3 at this point. So it won't print what it should. So unfortunately, it's present in Internet Explorer 11, you have to be aware of that. But the next question, we've talked about the browser support, but how about if you really can use this? Does it mean that if only IE 11 currently supports the spec, you can't use it? Well, that's not true. There are 2 projects I wanted to mention. First is Tracer Compiler by Google, which transpiles ECMAScript 6 code to ECMAScript 5. It's mostly good for testing. I wouldn't try to use it in any larger production code because you're not really fully controlling the performance. Just to make the implementation conform to the spec, they have to put some function invocations in many places. So sometimes, and since function invocations can be expensive, and you don't see it in the ECMAScript 6 code, it can lead to performance problems that you won't see at the first glance. But there's another project called devs.js by Oflasus I mentioned before. It's not for the full ECMAScript 6 stuff, just for latent const, and maybe there will be some additions later, but for now it's latent const. But the main idea of devs.js compared to Tracer is that it's not intrusive. For example, it preserves white spaces around the code, and it doesn't introduce any additional complexity. The idea is that if you have the code like the first one, and what devs really does, it parses the code, constructs the abstract syntax tree, and the only thing it does, it changes lets and cons to vars, maybe throwing some errors if it's used incorrectly by performing static analysis. But the only thing it does, it modifies variable names by putting a little suffix if it's needed, like in this example. So formally, all these declarations will still be performed at the top of the code by the browser, but since the only place in the code where this $0 will be used is inside this block, then you get the same semantics as if you really used ECMAScript like latent const here. And it's very cool because it doesn't introduce any additional complexity. And if you look at the resulting code, it looks very similar to the code, to the source code. So you really keep control of the performance and nothing gets screwed up. There are no source maps for devs.js. Maybe they will be added for the future, but they're not really essential since all the formatting of the code is kept the same. And if you look at the browser's code when debugging, you can see clear correspondence between the resulting code and the source code. And there is a grand plugin if you want to automate the generation to be able to use devs code in your application code freely. Grand devs, which I wrote, so you can easily hook it up to Grand. Another topic I want to talk about is our rest parameters and spread operators. The problem we have here is the arguments object. This is a code we see quite often, since the arguments object contains all the arguments passed to the function, and it looks like an array. It has fields. You can refer to variables by argument 0, arguments 1, and so on. And it has the length property that says you how many parameters there are, but it's not really an array. It was created before the array was actually added to the specification of JavaScript. And because of that, it doesn't inherit any array functions. It's a regular object. So there is no slice, for example. But it still you can still perform a slice on the arguments object, but since it's not on the prototype of this object, you have to explicitly use the slice method of an array, for example, of a simple empty array, and you have to call it on the arguments objects. So in this way, the aim what we wanted to do is maybe invoke subcon before, but we wanted to, the invocation of f should really refer to the invocation of g, but we just want to omit the first parameters. So for example, f012 would refer to g12, just omitting the first argument. And we have a lot of boilerplate code here. We have an apply, which doesn't look like it's needed. We have a reference to the this argument, which we really didn't want to change at this point, and we have to use the slice. We have to put an empty array. We have to use the call invocation, and there are a lot of parents. it doesn't look nice, and if you look at this code, it's very hard to capture what's really important, which is really this G, and at the end of the sentence, which parameters you choose. So REST parameters and spread operators are meant to solve this problem. First of all, you can forget about the arguments object. If you, in the function declaration, if you put 3 dots in front of the last parameter, in the function body, all the parameters from this one, in this case, it will be all starting from the second one, will be put in an array that is named as the variable name, in this case, rest. So, as we have in this case, if we invoke f2a3, we'll get an array a and 3. The regular array, not an arguments object, that is not a real array. Another another thing is spread operator. It looks like the previous one, but it's really officially it's something different, because in the first example, we don't start with a REST array. We start with parameters passed to the functions and those to the function f, and those parameters get collected and put in the REST array. And in the second case, we have something opposite. We have an array at the start, and we want to invoke the function with arguments taken from this array. So we transform it to another way. And another cool thing is that it doesn't only work in function invocations. It works in many other places. For example, if you wanted to create an array that looks like an A but have something on the front, 0 on the front and C on the back, you just can define it like that. You put the 3 dots A in the middle, and it just works. So if you look at the initial problem, we want to invoke G with the same arguments as F was invoked, but omitting the first one. It will look like that when rewritten. It's much clearer. You clearly see what's happening. You don't have magic parameters that are not put in the function declarations. It's very readable. Another example, a little more complicated. If you wanted to make something like cited above work, that is, if we invoke f with any number of parameters, not necessarily those 3, then it invokes g with some 2 parameters put at the beginning and an additional parameter put at the end. And first, we have to convert the arguments object to the actual array using the array slice call invocation. And there's this 1 at the end so that we omit the first one as we wanted. Then we need to push the first 2 zeros at the beginning and the 1 at the end. And then we use g apply. Of course, we have to pull this null and these array args. And this code is very imperative. We'd like to make it look more nicer and more declarative. And it looks like that. You just put the rest array, you put 2 zeros and the ... rest in the middle, and it just works in 1 line in the function body instead of 4. And actually, this is supported currently by current stable version of Firefox. So you can easily try that code in Firefox, experiment with it. It's available now. No other browsers support it yet, though, except Firefox. Another cool feature coming in ECMAScript 6 is our arrow functions. So one of the problems is the function keyword is too long. And when Brendan Ake was once asked if he wanted to, if it was possible for him to change just one thing in JavaScript, to go back in time and change it, what would he change? And he said that he would change the function keyword because it is too long. And it seems like a small thing, but if you have to type it very often, it can take a lot of time. And there is another thing. If you want to create a very simple inline function, inline anonymous function that just transforms the variable and returns something, then except for using the function keyword, you have to use the return, which is also long. For example, let's say we want to print squares of all numbers starting from 1 to 4 to 3. So we have to look like that. We have to implement it like that. We use console log, and we have to put the function. We have the function keyword, return, and we invoke it on the I. So there's also some boilerplate code. We have this function, we have parents, we have return, closing parents, which we don't really need. And with arrow functions, it looks like that. If you have one parameter, you don't have to put array brackets. If you wanted to put more parameter than one, you would use brackets and parameters divided by commas. But for one parameter, you don't need. And if you want to invoke only one instructions, you can also omit parents, omit brackets, curly braces that would have to be put for the regular function definition. If you need to put two statements or more, you still need the brackets, but for one you don't. And the cool thing is that if you don't put the brackets, then it's not only invoked what you write on the right side, but it's also returned. So in this case, we have very simple inline function. It reads really well, much better than the previous version. Another problem with regular functions is non-lexical dis. Functions have their own dis, which usually is null in strict mode, and the global window object is non-strict mode. You can lead to the very weird and nasty bugs. If you look at this example, we just wanted to this is a simple class that that's aim is to make sure we did invoke the f function on time. We should do it manually, but if we didn't, there should be some timeout put, not just 0. Forgot to do it. But after the function invocation in set timeout, let's say you put 10 seconds or something like that. So you wanted to make sure that it is invoked among the first 10 seconds. If it's not, there's an error printed that you did something wrong. And unfortunately, we use this.invoke, but the problem is that this doesn't refer to our class instance. It refers to the null or global object. And it's especially nasty in sloppy mode where you get the global object. If you don't invoke parameters, but you, for example, set a variable to some value, you just accidentally set a variable of the window object, which can bite you in some completely different part of the code. Arrow functions solve this by not overwriting the this variable. Inside the arrow function, this is taken from the outer scope, so something like that works completely fine. By the way, these empty brackets mean that the function takes no arguments. If you wanted to put one argument, you can omit the brackets. For any other situations, you need to put them. And Firefox supports it, even in the stable version. So this is another thing you can experiment with. In fact, Firefox engineers, when writing their Firefox code in JavaScript, use those arrow functions extensively at the moment. Another thing is the for-of, which allows iterating over arrays, sets, and many other things that have an iterator defined. One of the problems we have, there should be var I in A, not A length, sorry for that. But if we did something like that without this length, then we are not iterating over array values, but over its keys. So we just get 0, 1, 2 instead of ABC, which we wanted. A common way to solving that is just use a regular for loop with a variable and referring to this variable. But in ECMAScript 6, we have the for-of construct, which iterates over what iterator returns. In the case of arrays, this is just their values. This should be console log I, not A, not I. And Firefox supports it. This is a little controversial topic, which is simulating classical inheritance in JavaScript. But if you wanted to do that, if you needed to do that, then to do it fully results in a code like that. First, declare the constructor for the person, which sets the name of the person. Then you put a function on the prototype to introduce themselves. And let's say we wanted to make a subclass programmer that, as we know, programmers are also people, but they're also programmers, so we wanted to reflect that. And how can we do that? First of all, we want to make the programmer constructor do everything that the person constructor does. We may do something more if we want, but we do need to do that. And to not repeat the code, because if we just repeated the code, then later we could change something in the person declaration and suddenly we have code that is behaving differently. We need to do person.call passing this and arguments. But it's not all. We want all the functions to inherit from the functions of the person prototype. So there is in ECMAScript 5 there is object.create operator that object.create method that takes a prototype and creates an object. It takes an object and creates another object that is inheriting from this one. So in this case we have programmer prototype inheriting from person prototype, which means that all programmers will get the same functions as the person invocations do. But if we do something like that, then if we check the constructor property, which should point us to the function that was used to construct the actual object, then we would get the person, even though we wanted to get a programmer. So we need to fix that after assigning the prototype. Then, if we want to change the function introduce, but not to redefine it completely, but to use what's defined above, but also to do something different, we need to put this very lengthy code person.prototype.introduce.apply of these arguments, and only then to do our own action. If we do all this work, then if we do our programmer equals new programmer of John, then we get in the console on invoking the introduce method, you get I'm John, I'm a programmer. And this is how it will look in ECMAScript 6. We have a class keyword. We have a constructor method. We have a way of defining methods without a function keyword. We just put it one below another. If we want to redefine a method completely, that's fine. But if we want to still invoke the upper method, we just use the keyword supper. And it looks like that. Look that we didn't define the constructor method on the programmer. We could do that. We could redefine it completely. We could use supper and then do something else. But if we don't do it, it just inherits automatically. So let's mix it up. Let's say we wanted to create a class superhero that has some name, and as all superheroes have some powers. So we want to be able to call new superhero name, and on the next argument we want to put comma-separated powers. So we need to use array.slide.call arguments 1 to get all the other parameters into this powers array. And let's say that we don't want to add the speed power. We don't want to need to do that because, as we know, all superheroes are speedy. And let's have a use power function on the superhero, which will just use a console log. I've used the power and print the power. And let's say we want to invoke all the powers, but not just one by one in order, because there can be a lot of them. We want to schedule it so that it's done asynchronously. Then we have a couple of problems. First, we can't simply iterate over an array without using some indexes. We need to use the for var I, and iterate over the array indexes. The next problem is that in the set timeout we have a function, and we can't just put this there because it would refer to the function inside the set timeout, to the null, and not to the this superhero. So we need to assign a self variable at the beginning of the function and use it. Another problem is that since it's asynchronous, if we wouldn't put the function power of powers from I around the set timeout, then we would get it all of the last I that would happen, which is this.powers.length, which wouldn't even be valid since there is no such power. It's outside of an array. And this is how it will look in ECMAScript 6. We have a constructor. We can use REST parameters to declare them. If we want to put a speed at the beginning of the array, we just use the spread operator, no slide call, and stuff like that. We have a concise method declarations. We can use for of. There is lexical this because we're using array functions, so it's much clearer to read. And I wanted to say about one thing. If you wanted to test this code, ECMAScript 6 code, this tracer project I told about before. But actually, okay. So I need to log in now. I hope it will redirect them. Okay. Okay. We have this tracer project I told about before, and recently it has been implemented, the support for it has been implemented on JSBean. You just click that arrow here, and from the available languages, you can choose JavaScript, JavaScript, but there's also a tracer option. And if you choose that, okay, that was what I wanted. Okay. You can choose tracer here, and if you go to the console and invoke the code, it will get parsed by tracer and will be to the console that will print what you expect. So we can just play with it and try it, and if you have some feedback, you can report it to the ECMA organization. Maybe they will improve it. So that will be all. Thank you. Are there any questions? No questions. Oh, there is one.
Do you know where it will be available for the production projects? So in all major browsers?
The ECMAScript 6 specification is near its finish. It should be finished by the end of the year. So I guess it will take another year to be fully implemented, although most common parts are already being implemented in browsers, so you don't have to wait for implementing the whole specification by all browsers to use some parts of it. And the good thing is that a lot of browsers currently are moving to the rolling release model. So once it's implemented, it's almost everywhere in Chrome, Firefox, and Opera. Only Internet Explorer and Safari are left with the old model. But if you look at the Internet Explorer, they also improved the situation a lot, because Microsoft recently decided that the company will be auto-updating users to the newest Internet Explorer available for the system, unless the person or the administrator explicitly opts out of the feature. So by default, you get updates. And you can already see this. On Windows XP, there is no support for any Internet Explorer version larger but by 8, so it still has quite a significant market share. But if you look at IE9, for example, which is the latest version available on Vista, but on XP you got IE10 and you will get IE11, then IE9 has quite a small market share, much lower than IE8. So once Windows XP dies, I think it will be much better, and even Internet Explorer will be quite fast. Besides, if you only have like one browser that makes some problems, some older versions, then you can serve different JavaScript to all other browsers, and to this one you can serve JS transformed by tracer, for example, or other. When it comes to lets and cons, as I said, there is this devs.js and the Grand Task, and we're already using it for code that is going to production. So you can start using it now, but it should be available to browsers in a year or so. Anything else?
Hi. Do you know if there are plans to remove some kind of redundant stuff from the specification? I mean, the REST parameters can replace the arguments. So do they plan to remove argument stuff in future versions?
That's not planned, because this is not really needed, I think. One of the ideas that the TC39 committee that is governing this ECMAScript specification is to not break existing code. And you will have a lot of legacy code in the internet lingering over the years that will use these arguments objects. So we don't want to break the internet for those users. But you're not forced to use that.
Yeah, but the same situation was in Java world. So they were struggling with the legacy code because they wanted to keep the backward compatibility with that, and it caused a lot of problems for them. That's why I'm asking if they have a kind of plans to kind of clean up some stuff and remove.
Most stuff won't be cleaned up. The most important things that really caused some problems that weren't available without significant changes were fixed in the strict mode. That was the idea, to not create implicit globals, to throw more errors and stuff like that, which really hurt programmers that even tried to use modern technologies and not succumb to all these old ones. So this one was fixed. Just remember to put the use strict pragma at the beginning of your function code. But for the rest of the code, like the arguments objects, you can just omit it. It won't hurt you if you don't use it. And so you can use tools like JS hints or other validators that will force you to not use those dangerous things.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you.